Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today in our reading we have several psalms in which David is crying out to the Lord and seeking justice. Many people had come up against him in various situations in his life, and they want to kill him. They're persecuting him, chasing him, and for no really good reason. David had not done them any harm, and yet they repay his good with evil. And so David is wanting God to recompense them according to their deeds. And in Psalm 62, we find him in a situation similar to that. Um, he mentions the type of people that are coming up against him in verses 3 and 4, where it says, "How long will you assail a man, that you may murder him, all of you, like a leaning wall, like a tottering fence? They have counseled only to thrust him down from his high position. They delight in falsehood. They bless with their mouth, but inwardly they curse." So David, here once again in the midst of his trials, his difficulties, he writes a psalm. And in this psalm, he has some things that he knows about God that helps him in this situation. And it can be no surprise that these same things that he knew about God would help us too when we find ourselves in trials, difficulties, and sufferings. There's basically four things he knew about God that helped him out. Continuing on in verse 5, he says, "My soul, wait in silence for God only, for my hope is from him. He is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be shaken." All right, so he recognized that God was his hope, his rock, his salvation, and his stronghold. And this is very interesting that he uses these things to describe the way that God helps him in these difficult times. I think sometimes when we go to God in prayer, and when we find ourselves in situations similar to this, we really are just looking for God to help us in one way only. And David does bring out that particular way in here, and that is salvation. He says that he is my rock and my salvation. And salvation has to do with being delivered, being basically delivered from the situation. In David's case, it would have been having salvation, being saved from his enemies, and having that situation resolved. And that's usually the first place and the only place that we go. We say, "God, just get me out of this situation. Save me. Deliver me out of this turmoil." And that is a viable thing to request. David himself recognizes God as his salvation. And maybe sometimes we underplay this a little bit because we do recognize the fact that God allows us to go through sufferings. He allows the righteous to suffer. We cover that quite extensively through the book of Job as we read through it. That even righteous people, godly people, faithful people undergo sufferings for various reasons. But that truth should not cause us to cease to think of God as a means of salvation, as a means of deliverance. The psalmist, time and time again, go to God with trust, with faith that God was their salvation, their deliverance. And obviously God is powerful enough and gracious enough and loving enough to deliver us out of our sufferings and our trials. And many, many times he does. And I'm even tempted to say that he does that even more times than he doesn't. He delivers us. Our God is a God of deliverance and salvation. So we should pray for that. But we shouldn't just limit God to that, as though the only way God can help us in our situation is if he pulls us out of it. Because as we see with these other descriptions of God that David gives, there are other ways that he helps us. For one, he shows himself as our hope, God is the one that gives us hope. When we're suffering, when we're going through a hard time, maybe it's a difficulty at work or with our family, or finances, whatever it is, God is our hope. Because if we didn't have God, think about it. We would really have no hope. We might try to get ourselves out of the situation, but many times the situation is too big for us. And we have to recognize the fact that there's really nothing we can do to fix it. But when we remember that there is a God in heaven watching over our lives, a wonderful God, a loving God and a powerful God watching over us, that gives us hope. He also gives us the ultimate hope of one day being delivered from all of our trials. The hope, of course, of being with Him eternally, being in His very presence. So God gives us hope in our trials. Also, He is mentioned as being a rock. David said, "He only is my rock." And a rock is basically just a firm footing, a place where you can stand. If you're maybe out in the water somewhere and you're drowning and you can't get above water, what a relief it would be to find a rock to stand on. Something firm to stand on to where you can lift yourself up out of the water. And many times in our circumstances in life, we feel like we're drowning. We feel like life is out of control. Life is full of chaos. And if we could just find a firm footing, something to stand on, that would be at least something. And what we find is that God is that firm footing. He is the rock. He is the one that we can stand on. When everything else is going haywire and crazy, God is our rock. And we can stand upon Him, stand upon His promises, stand upon His faithfulness, stand upon His love, and the list goes on and on and on. So, even if God doesn't deliver us right away from the sufferings, He still offers Himself up as our rock, as our firm footing. But also the psalmist mentions God as being His stronghold. His stronghold. This would be a place where you could go and find protection. David would be very familiar with strongholds, being a military leader himself. But this is a place where an army could build up a fortified place and be able to stand ground against the enemy. And for us, God is that stronghold. Later on, He'll call Him His refuge. He says in verse 7, "On God my salvation and my glory rest, the rock of my strength, my refuge is in God." And so, even in verse 8, he says, God is a refuge for us. In other words, a place to go where you can be protected, where you can feel safe. Maybe if you're thinking about, you're out in the heat of the day, and you find a shade tree or something. It's kind of like your refuge. You can get out of the heat of the sun and find some comfort. Or maybe going even better, going into an air-conditioned building or something, and you can find refuge from the heat. Well, God is that for us. When we're in the midst of the trial, the difficulty, we can go to God in prayer, and we can submit our lives to Him, commit the situation to Him, cast all our cares and anxieties on Him, and He can be for us a refuge, a safe haven. He can comfort us during it all. He may not take away the storm, but at the same time, He watches over us and protects us through the storm and sustains us through the storm. And so He can be our stronghold. He can be our refuge throughout the difficulty. And so we see God as being able to help us in various ways. And I would say that He's not limited to these 4 ways that we talked about today. But He can help us at least in these 4 ways. One, again, by being our salvation, by delivering us out of the situation. Secondly, by being our hope and giving us hope throughout the situation. Thirdly, by being our rock, a firm place to stand when we're in the midst of chaos. And then also being our stronghold, a place of refuge that we can hide in the difficult times. What a wonderful God we have. What a wonderful privilege it is to have a God who offers himself up in all of these various ways to become our help in time of need. Well, I thank you guys for listening in today. I love you guys. Hope you guys have a great day. God bless.